The cramped, dimly lit room buzzed with the hum of ancient appliances and the muffled sounds of arguing neighbors. In this tiny corner of a forgotten part of the city, a boy named Ethan took his first breath. His mother, Sarah, cradled him close, her weary eyes glimmering with a mix of love and worry. His father, Jack, stood by the window staring out at the graffiti covered walls of the adjacent building, his calloused hands clenched into fists. "He's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Jack turned, his face softening for a moment as he gazed at his newborn son. "Yeah, he is," he agreed, before the wrinkles of concern returned to his brow. "But how are we going to feed another mouth?" As Ethan grew, those words seemed to echo through their lives like a haunting refrain. The boy quickly learned that in their world every morsel was precious, every penny counted. He watched his parents work themselves to the bone, taking on multiple jobs, skipping meals so he could eat. Despite their efforts, they could never seem to get ahead. By the time Ethan was 10, he had developed a keen understanding of the vast divide between his family's circumstances and the glittering world he glimpsed on TV and in shop windows. He yearned for the things other kids seemed to take for granted: new clothes, toys, enough food to feel full. One sweltering summer day, as Ethan wandered the streets of his neighborhood, his stomach growling, he paused outside a corner store. Through the grimy window, he could see rows of colorful candy bars, bags of chips, and cold drinks. His mouth watered at the thought of how they might taste. Without conscious thought, his hand slipped into the pocket of a distracted passerby. In an instant, he felt the cool touch of coins against his fingertips. His heart raced as he quickly withdrew his hand and darted away, not daring to look back. Around the corner, safely out of sight, Ethan examined his prize. 3 quarters and a dime. Not much, but enough for a candy bar. As he pushed open the store door, a small bell jingled, and the shopkeeper glanced up from his newspaper. "Can I help you, kid?" the man asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he placed the coins on the counter. Just this, please," he stammered, grabbing a chocolate bar from the nearby rack. As he unwrapped the candy outside, savoring the rich, sweet taste, a mix of emotions swirled within him. There was guilt, yes, but it was overshadowed by a heady rush of excitement and satisfaction. For the first time in his young life, Ethan felt a sense of control over his circumstances. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's nimble fingers found their way into more pockets, his techniques growing bolder and more refined with each successful theft. He told himself it was necessary, that he was simply taking what the world owed him and his family. At home, he secretly stashed away his ill-gotten gains, dreaming of the day he could surprise his parents with enough money to ease their burdens. Yet even as his hidden wealth grew, so did the gnawing fear of being caught, the shame that threatened to consume him in quiet moments. Ethan stood at a crossroads, teetering between the allure of easy money and the values his parents had struggled to instill in him. Little did he know that fate was about to intervene, setting him on a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Ethan crouched behind a neatly trimmed hedge. His eyes were fixed on a modest 2-story house, its windows dark save for a faint glow from what he guessed was the living room. This was the house he'd been watching for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as he saw the living room light flick off. He counted to 60, then slowly crept towards the side of the house, keeping low to avoid detection. Just as he reached for the latch on a ground floor window, a voice cut through the silence. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan froze, his blood running cold. Slowly, he turned to face the source of the voice. A man stood there, probably in his mid-30s, with kind eyes that contradicted the stern set of his jaw. In the fading light, Ethan could see the man was holding a bag of groceries. I, I, Ethan stammered, his mind racing for an excuse. Then, remembering his old standby, he blurted out, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm just really hungry. I was hoping maybe you had some food to spare." The man's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained wary. "You're awfully far from the main street for a beggar," he observed. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan," he replied, trying to look as pitiful as possible. The man studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm Daniel. Look, Ethan, I don't make a habit of inviting strangers into my home, but I also can't stand the thought of someone going hungry." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Tell you what, if you can cook, I'll provide the ingredients, and we can share the meal. How does that sound?" Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. This was not how he expected the encounter to go. He knew nothing about cooking. His meals usually consisted of whatever he could steal or scrounge up. But the prospect of a real meal, and maybe even more opportunities to case the house, was too tempting to pass up. Yeah, I can cook, Ethan lied, hoping his face didn't betray his nervousness. Daniel's eyebrows raised slightly, as if he didn't quite believe Ethan but was willing to play along. All right then, he said, gesturing towards the front door. Let's see what you can do. As Ethan followed Daniel into the house, his mind raced. He was entering unfamiliar territory, both literally and figuratively. The warm, welcoming interior of the home was a stark contrast to the cold streets he was used to, and Daniel's unexpected kindness threw him off balance. It was so much easier to steal from faceless strangers. In the kitchen, Daniel set down his groceries and turned to Ethan. So, what do you think you can make with these ingredients? Ethan stared at the assortment of vegetables, a package of chicken, and various pantry staples. He had no idea where to begin. Swallowing hard, he realized he was in way over his head. But something made him hesitate to admit his lie. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe a desperate hope that he could somehow muddle through this and still come out ahead. How about chicken soup? Ethan suggested, naming the only dish he could think of that seemed remotely possible. Daniel nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sounds good. The pots are in that cabinet there, and utensils are in the drawer by the sink. I'll be in the living room if you need anything. As Daniel left the kitchen, Ethan stood frozen, the enormity of his situation sinking in. He was alone in a stranger's kitchen, expected to cook a meal he had no idea how to prepare. But more than that, he was being trusted, perhaps for the first time in his life. And the weight of that trust was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. With shaking hands, Ethan reached for a pot. He had no idea what he was doing, but he was determined to try. Little did he know that this moment, this simple act of attempting to cook a meal, would be the first step on a journey that would change his life forever. Ethan stood in Daniel's kitchen, surrounded by ingredients he barely recognized. His eyes darted around the room, cataloging items he might be able to pocket later. A gleaming watch on the windowsill caught his attention, and he made a mental note of its location. Turning back to the task at hand, Ethan realized he had no idea how to start cooking. He grabbed a pot, filled it with water, and tossed in the whole chicken, still in its packaging. He then roughly chopped some vegetables, throwing them in without removing peels or ends. As the concoction bubbled on the stove, a foul smell began to permeate the kitchen. Ethan wrinkled his nose, but shrugged it off. Cooking wasn't his concern. He was here to scope out the house and its valuables. When Daniel entered the kitchen, his face contorted at the smell. Everything all right in here? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Ethan nodded, ladling the unappetizing mixture into bowls. Daniel took a spoonful and immediately spat it out. I'm sorry, Ethan, but this isn't edible, Daniel said gently. Have you ever cooked before? Ethan shrugged, feigning disappointment while his eyes continued to scan the room. Guess not, he muttered. Daniel sighed and began to clean up the mess. Let me show you how it's done, he offered, pulling out fresh ingredients. As Daniel cooked, explaining each step, Ethan only half listened. He was more interested in the expensive-looking knife set on the counter and the tablet charging in the corner. When the new soup was ready, Daniel served it with a smile. Try this, he encouraged. Ethan took a bite, surprised by the rich flavor. For a moment, he felt a twinge of something. Gratitude, perhaps? But he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to get soft. It's okay, he said noncommittally, already planning how he might sneak some valuables out when Daniel wasn't looking. As they ate in silence, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. This house was a gold mine, and he intended to make the most of it. The fact that Daniel seemed kind and trusting only made him an easier target in Ethan's eyes. Little did Ethan know his stay in this house would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. But for now, he remained focused on one thing: what he could steal next. The weekend arrived, and with it came a new opportunity for Ethan. Daniel had asked him to accompany him to the local farmer's market to pick up fresh produce and other groceries. For Ethan, this was more than just a simple shopping trip. It was a chance to practice his craft in a bustling, target-rich environment. As they walked through the crowded market, Ethan's eyes darted from stall to stall, taking in the colorful displays of fruits, vegetables, and artisanal goods. But while Daniel saw wholesome food, Ethan saw a playground of potential marks. "Oh, what do you think we should get for dinner tonight?" Daniel asked, pausing at a vegetable stand. Ethan shrugged, his attention focused on a distracted woman fumbling with her purse nearby. "Whatever you want," he mumbled. As Daniel engaged the vendor in conversation about the best tomatoes, Ethan saw his chance. With practiced ease, he bumped into the woman, apologized profusely, and in the process managed to slip her wallet from her open purse into his pocket. The rush of adrenaline was intoxicating. This was what he lived for: the thrill of the take, the satisfaction of outsmarting his victims. Throughout the morning, Ethan continued his covert activities. A watch here, a phone there, cash from an open register when a vendor was distracted, all while Daniel remained blissfully unaware, engrossed in selecting the best produce and chatting with the friendly sellers. At one point, Daniel handed Ethan some cash. "Why don't you go pick out some fruit you like?" he suggested with a smile. Ethan nodded, pocketing the money. He had no intention of spending it on fruit. Instead, he used the opportunity to case a jewelry stand, his fingers itching to snatch a gleaming bracelet left carelessly close to the edge of the table. On the walk home, Daniel chatted enthusiastically about the meals he planned to make with their purchases. Ethan made appropriate noises of agreement, but his mind was elsewhere, tallying up his successful heists and planning how to fence the more valuable items. "Did you enjoy the market?" Daniel asked as they neared the house. Ethan allowed himself a genuine smile. "Yeah, it was great," he said, and he meant it, just not for the reasons Daniel might have assumed. As they unpacked the groceries in the kitchen, Ethan felt a familiar mix of excitement and wariness. He'd had a good day, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. Daniel's kindness was still just a means to an end, a cover that allowed him access to more opportunities. A few weeks had passed since Ethan's arrival at Daniel's house. The routine was simple: help with chores during the day, and in the evenings Daniel would attempt to teach Ethan basic reading and writing. Tonight was no different, as they sat at the dining room table, books and papers spread out before them. "All right, Ethan," Daniel said, pointing to a simple sentence in the workbook. "Can you read this for me?" Ethan squinted at the letters, his brow furrowing in concentration. "The cat is black," he read slowly, the words coming out haltingly, but correctly. Daniel beamed. "Excellent! You're making real progress." Ethan allowed himself a small smile, but not for the reasons Daniel might have thought. In his mind, he was already calculating how this new skill could benefit his true objectives. As Daniel turned to write something in the workbook, Ethan's eyes wandered around the room, taking mental inventory as he always did. The antique clock on the mantel, the silver picture frames, the leather-bound books that looked valuable, all potential targets. "Now, let's try writing a sentence," Daniel said, drawing Ethan's attention back to the lesson. "How about, 'The sun is bright'?" Ethan picked up the pencil, carefully forming each letter. As he wrote, a thought occurred to him. If he could read and write better, he might be able to forge documents, read security codes, or understand valuable information he came across during his thefts. "Very good," Daniel praised, looking over Ethan's shoulder. "Your handwriting is improving too." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Thanks," he muttered, trying to sound grateful while hiding his true thoughts. As the lesson continued, Ethan found himself oddly engaged. Not because he cared about learning for its own sake, but because he saw it as a tool, a means to an end. Every new word he learned was a potential key to bigger scores, more valuable thefts. When the lesson ended, Daniel patted Ethan on the shoulder. "You should be proud of yourself," he said warmly. "Learning to read and write can open up a whole new world for you." If only Daniel knew just what kind of world Ethan was imagining. As he headed to his room for the night, Ethan's mind was filled not with the joy of learning, but with schemes and plans. He imagined being able to read street signs more easily, to navigate escape routes, or writing convincing notes to trick unsuspecting victims. Lying in bed, Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Daniel thought he was helping a troubled kid turn his life around, but Ethan knew better. This was just another opportunity, another mark to exploit. As he drifted off to sleep, Ethan's last thoughts were of the valuable items he'd spotted around the house. Soon, he told himself. Soon he'd make his move, and all of this, the lessons, the kindness, the false sense of security, would be nothing more than a distant memory as he moved on to bigger and better scores. Weeks had passed since his arrival, and Ethan had settled into a routine at Daniel's house. He helped with chores, continued his reading lessons, and all the while kept his eyes open for opportunities to steal. However, a growing uneasiness had begun to gnaw at him. Daniel's persistent kindness was becoming harder to ignore, even as Ethan tried to maintain his emotional distance. One evening, as Ethan was tidying up the living room, he heard Daniel's excited voice from the study. "Ethan, come here, I've got great news." Curious despite himself, Ethan made his way to the study. Daniel was sitting at his desk, a wide grin on his face as he held up a piece of paper. "Remember that novel I've been working on?" Daniel asked, his eyes shining. "Well, a publisher just agreed to take it on. They're offering an advance, and it's more than I never expected." Ethan's ears perked up at the mention of money. "That's great," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic, while his mind raced with possibilities. Daniel stood up, still beaming. "I couldn't have done it without you. You know, having you here helping out, it gave me the time I needed to finish the book." A strange feeling twisted in Ethan's gut at these words, something between guilt and an emotion he couldn't quite name. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on gathering information. "So, when do you get the money?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. "They're sending a check tomorrow," Daniel replied, not noticing the glint in Ethan's eye. "I'll need to go to the bank to deposit it, but after that—" He trailed off, lost in thought for a moment, before turning back to Ethan with a smile. "We should celebrate. How about we order in your favorite takeout for dinner tomorrow?" Ethan nodded absently, his mind already formulating a plan. A check in the house. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. That night, as Daniel slept, Ethan crept down to the study. He searched quietly, methodically, looking for where Daniel might have put the check. After what felt like hours, he found it in a drawer, tucked inside an envelope. With trembling hands, Ethan opened the envelope and stared at the check. The amount made his eyes widen. It was more money than he'd ever seen in one place. As he stood there, check in hand, Ethan felt a war raging inside him. This was what he'd been waiting for, wasn't it? The big score, the chance to take the money and run, to start a new life somewhere else. But as he thought about running, Ethan realized that for the first time in years, he didn't want to. The thought of leaving this house, leaving Daniel, filled him with a strange sense of loss. Confused and conflicted, Ethan carefully put the check back in the envelope and returned it to the drawer. He wasn't ready to make a decision yet. He told himself he was just waiting for a better opportunity, that he'd take the money once it was cash and easier to steal. But as he crawled back into bed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and he wasn't sure which way he was going to fall. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. Ethan lay in his bed, wide awake, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Daniel had gone to the bank earlier that day to deposit the check. More importantly, he knew Daniel had withdrawn a significant amount in cash, planning to make some home improvements and treat Ethan to some new clothes. This was it. The moment Ethan had been waiting for. With practiced stealth, Ethan slipped out of bed. He'd memorized which floorboards creaked and avoided them as he made his way to Daniel's room. Pausing outside the door, he listened intently, hearing only the steady breathing of deep sleep. Slowly, carefully, he eased the door open. Daniel's form was a shadowy lump under the covers, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding. Ethan's eyes, adjusted to the darkness, scanned the room. There, on the dresser, was Daniel's wallet, and beside it a thick envelope that Ethan knew contained the cash. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. This was more money than he'd ever stolen at once. Enough to start a new life, to leave this city and its memories behind. As his fingers closed around the envelope, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. Memories of Daniel's kindness flashed through his mind. The patient reading lessons, the shared meals, the genuine smiles. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, but then he hardened his heart. This was who he was, wasn't it? A thief, someone who took what he wanted and never looked back. Daniel's kindness was just naivety, a weakness to be exploited. With a deep breath, Ethan slipped the envelope into his pocket. He took Daniel's wallet, too, for good measure. Then, moving as silently as he'd entered, he left the room. Back in his own room, Ethan quickly stuffed his few belongings into a backpack. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. He pushed the feeling aside. There was no room for guilt in his world. As he prepared to leave, Ethan paused at his desk. The reading workbooks Daniel had bought for him lay there, filled with his improving handwriting. On an impulse, he scribbled a quick note. Thanks for everything. Sorry it had to be this way. E. He left the note on his pillow. It was more than he'd ever left any of his previous victims, but something compelled him to do it. With one last look around the room that had been his home for the past weeks, Ethan slipped out the window and into the night. The weight of the stolen money was heavy in his pocket, but not as heavy as the unexpected weight in his chest. As he walked away from the house, Ethan told himself that this was a victory. He'd scored big, just like he'd planned. So why didn't it feel like a victory? Why did each step away from Daniel's house feel like it was taking him further from something important, rather than towards freedom? Shaking off these unsettling thoughts, Ethan forced himself to focus on his next move. He was a thief, and thieves didn't look back. They just moved on to the next score. But as the night enveloped him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind in that house, something more valuable than any amount of money. The city streets were eerily quiet as Ethan wandered, the weight of the stolen money feeling heavier with each step. He had done it, pulled off the biggest heist of his life, yet the triumph he had expected eluded him. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ethan found himself in a small park. He collapsed onto a bench, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He pulled out the envelope, counting the money for what felt like the 100th time. It was all there, enough to start a new life anywhere he wanted. So why did he feel so lost? Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Daniel's house. By now, Daniel would have discovered the theft. He imagined the look of betrayal on Daniel's face, the disappointment in his eyes. The image made Ethan's stomach churn uncomfortably. Stop it, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. This is who you are. This is what you do. But the words rang hollow. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself questioning his choices. He thought about the reading lessons, the shared meals, the genuine kindness Daniel had shown him. No one had ever treated him like that before. As the morning wore on, Ethan roamed the city, unable to shake the feeling of unease. He passed by his old haunts, the alleys where he used to sleep, the corners where he'd pick pockets. They seemed smaller now, dingier, less like home and more like a prison he'd escaped. He thought about leaving town, starting fresh somewhere new, but something held him back. The city that had once felt vast and full of opportunities now seemed to be closing in on him. Every face he saw reminded him of Daniel. Every kind gesture from a stranger twisted the knife of guilt deeper. By afternoon, Ethan found himself in a dingy diner, picking at a plate of food he couldn't taste. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized he had no idea what to do next. The money in his pocket no longer felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like chains, binding him to a life he was no longer sure he wanted. As night fell again, Ethan found himself back in Daniel's neighborhood, drawn there by a force he couldn't explain. He stood across the street from the house, staring at the warm light spilling from the windows. As he stood there, torn between the urge to run and the inexplicable pull towards the house, Ethan understood that he was facing the most important choice of his life. Whatever he decided in the next few moments would define who he was and who he would become. With a deep breath, Ethan took a step forward, still unsure where his path would lead. The street was quiet as Ethan approached Daniel's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood before the door, the stolen money feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. For several long moments, he remained frozen, his hand raised to knock but unable to follow through. Inside, he could hear muffled movement. Daniel was awake, probably still grappling with the betrayal Ethan had inflicted upon him. The thought made Ethan's stomach churn with an unfamiliar feeling, guilt. Before he could change his mind, Ethan knocked on the door. The sounds inside ceased abruptly, followed by cautious footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there stood Daniel, his eyes widening in surprise and relief. "Ethan," Daniel breathed, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. "You're okay. I was so worried." The genuine concern in Daniel's voice hit Ethan like a physical blow. He had expected anger, accusations, maybe even the police. But this unconditional care was something he'd never experienced before. I'm sorry," Ethan stammered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope of cash, holding it out to Daniel with shaking hands. "I took this, and your wallet. I shouldn't have. I want to give it back." Daniel looked at the envelope, then back at Ethan's face. Instead of taking the money, he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come inside, Ethan. Let's talk." Confused and emotional, Ethan entered the house. They sat at the kitchen table, the envelope of money between them like a barrier. For a long moment, neither spoke. "Why did you come back?" Daniel finally asked, his voice gentle. Ethan struggled to find the words. I I don't know. No one's ever treated me like you have. I thought I knew who I was, what I wanted, but now I'm not sure anymore." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Ethan, what you did was wrong, but the fact that you came back, that you're trying to make it right, that says a lot about who you really are." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking through. "I want to change," he whispered, the realization hitting him as he said the words. "I don't want to be a thief anymore, but I don't know how to be anything else." Daniel reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Change isn't easy, Ethan, but it's possible, and you don't have to do it alone." For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was uncertain and would undoubtedly be difficult, but for once, he wasn't facing it alone. As dawn broke outside, Ethan and Daniel continued to talk about the past, about the future, about second chances, and the courage it takes to change. And with each word, Ethan felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. This was his turning point, he realized. The moment where he could choose to become something more than what life had taught him to be. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would make the most of this second chance. He would learn, grow, and become someone worthy of the trust Daniel had placed in him. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in his life, Ethan was ready to face it head on. The following morning, Ethan awoke in his old room, the events of the previous night still swirling in his mind. For a moment, he feared it had all been a dream, that he'd wake up back on the streets. But as he looked around, he saw the familiar surroundings of Daniel's house, and a wave of relief washed over him. He made his way downstairs, the smell of coffee and toast guiding him to the kitchen. Daniel was there, preparing breakfast. He looked up as Ethan entered, offering a warm smile. "Good morning, Ethan. Did you sleep well?" Ethan nodded, still feeling slightly awkward. "Yeah, thanks." They sat down to eat, a comfortable silence settling between them. As they finished, Daniel cleared his throat. "So, Ethan, I've been thinking about what we discussed last night, about you wanting to change." He paused, making sure he had Ethan's full attention. "I believe in second chances, and I want to help you, but it won't be easy. Are you sure this is what you want?" Ethan took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "I am," he said finally, his voice firm. "I don't want to go back to my old life. I want to be better." Daniel nodded, a look of pride crossing his face. "All right then, here's what I propose. You continue staying here, but we'll set some ground rules. You'll keep up with your reading and writing lessons, and I'll help you catch up on your education. In return, I expect honesty and effort from you. No more stealing, no more lies. Deal?" Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. It was more than he'd ever dared hope for. "Deal," he managed to say. "Good," Daniel smiled. "Now, there's one more thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. The same envelope containing the money Ethan had stolen and returned. "This is your salary for the work you've been doing around the house. I know it's not much, but it's a start. You've earned it, Ethan." Ethan stared at the envelope, then back at Daniel, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But after what I did," Daniel held up a hand to stop him. "The past is the past, Ethan. What matters is what you do from here on out. This is your chance to start building a life for yourself. Honestly." With trembling hands, Ethan accepted the envelope. It felt different now. Not like stolen goods, but like possibility, like hope. As the day progressed, Ethan threw himself into his tasks with newfound enthusiasm. He helped Daniel clean the house, cooked lunch with much better results than his first attempt, and spent the afternoon poring over his workbooks. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Daniel reading while Ethan practiced his writing, Ethan felt a sense of peace he'd never known before. He looked up at Daniel, the man who had given him a second chance when no one else would have. "Daniel?" he said softly. Daniel looked up from his book. "Yes, Ethan?" "Thank you," Ethan said simply, pouring all his gratitude into those two words. Daniel's eyes crinkled as he smiled. "You're welcome, Ethan. Remember, the hardest part of changing is deciding to do it. You've already taken that step. I'm proud of you. As Ethan returned to his writing, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in his life, he had a real home, a purpose, and someone who believed in him. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it. This was his new beginning, and he was determined to make the most of it.